Dukkha is a Pali word. It's a compound. It's made up of the prefix du and the word ka. So ka means space, empty space, while the prefix du conveys the idea of bad, painful, unpleasant, undesirable, and so on. So a dukkha is basically a painful space. And it's looked at in different ways. David Loy calls it a sense of lack, the painful emptiness that we find at the center of our being. One way that the tradition looks at it is it's like a badly fitting axle of a wheel. So if you think about ka, the empty space, this can also refer to the empty space at the hub of a wheel. And of course, the wheel is the basic symbol of Buddhism. So imagine a wheel and the axle goes through the wheel, the vehicle moves, but if the axle fits badly in the hub, the vehicle moves only with difficulty and grind. So dukkha is that sense of difficulty and grind in experience. It's characterized by drivenness, a sense of urgent necessity, the urgent sense that I've got to do this, I've got to get that, I've got to get rid of this other thing. Now, the Buddha teaches dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. So the cessation of dukkha, of course, is nibbana. And the Buddha compares the cessation of dukkha to the ending of hunger. So if you think about hunger, we are hungry, so we are driven to eat, have to eat, absolutely must eat. And then the eating satisfies us for a while, but inevitably we become hungry again. So we have to eat again and again and again and again and again. And this sense of again and again and again and again and again, this characterizes dukkha when the Buddha talks about it. So in contrast, the satisfaction that comes when hunger itself ceases. So what would that satisfaction be? It's not the same satisfaction as satisfying one's hunger. It's different. And we could speculate that it would be characterized by a peace that cannot be found through ordinary desire. Now this is nibbana, the peace of nibbana. And of course, nibbana is the cessation of dukkha. So dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. This is central to the Buddha's teaching. Now, I think, if I recall correctly, we were talking about impermanence last time. Let me just check. Yes, we did on the 2nd of June. We talked about impermanence, change. So the Buddha talks about dukkha in the context of anicca on one side, anatta on the other. So impermanence on one side, not self on the other. So there's always these three, what are called the three characteristics. Anicca, dukkha, anatta, always in that order. And dukkha sits right in the middle. So when we were talking about anicca, impermanence, impermanence is really central for the Buddha and central for the arising of insight. If we want insight, understanding, then impermanence, anicca, is central. And it's so important that the Buddha says to his son, Rahula, cultivate the perception of impermanence. For when you cultivate the perception of impermanence, the conceit I am will be abandoned. And abandoning the conceit I am is code for full enlightenment. In other words, if we cultivate the perception of impermanence, it'll take us to full enlightenment. Now, anicca is closely related to dukkha. And the reason for this is, again, if you look at the word itself, anicca, usually translated impermanent. Impermanent is a kind of very abstract term. And it's like, it doesn't sound like there's anything wrong with impermanent. Sounds okay to me. But when we look at the word itself and the way the word is used in the Buddha's time, first of all, anicca is a negative term. So not nicca. A means not. So not nicca, or in Sanskrit, not nitya. To be nicca is to be permanent. It's also, in more everyday usage, it means stable, constant, reliable. So in everyday Pali, nicca refers to what can be relied upon and therefore what can be taken for granted. To be anicca, impermanent, means to be unstable, inconstant, discontinuous, and therefore unreliable, not to be trusted. When we rely on something or someone unreliable, sooner or later we're disappointed. And this is bound to happen. So this is the link between anicca and dukkha. Any questions so far? I should have said, if you've got any question, just ask. If you want to zoomically raise your hand, you can, but I'm looking at my script, so I rely on Boyd to tell me that someone's raising their hand. Any question thus far?
Okay. Or you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question to Patrick Hart here. So just
the most direct way is just unmute yourself and ask, and I'll hear it. Okay, let's move on then. Dukkha has certain characteristics, and the Buddha introduces the concept in his first formal teaching, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, turning the Dharma wheel, when he talks about the Four Truths. So dukkha is the first truth, and then you have the arising of dukkha, the cessation of dukkha, the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. So when he's talking about the first truth, he talks about dukkha in 3 layers. And the first is normal everyday pain that's found in any human life. And by the way, sometimes you hear people say, the Buddha said life is suffering. He never said that. What he said is, dukkha is a fact. Pain is a fact. If we go through a human life, at some point, it will hurt. So this is the most surface level of dukkha, just ordinary everyday pain. The next layer is the pain inherent in change. So here we see the connection with impermanence. And this refers to the fact that our circumstances are in a state of continuous fluctuation and change. And this goes all the way from the micro to the macro. So all the way from, if you think about your meditation experience, from the beginning of a session to the end of a session, does it change? Yes. If you think about your life, from the beginning of your life to today, does it change? Yes. But for the Buddha, what he points out is it changes inevitably, and we are not in charge of these changes. And that's the crucial point. We're not in control of these changes. The changes are inevitable, but we're not in charge of them. So we can look at 2 instances. Take, for example, physical pain. As meditators, have you noticed that we are never still for any period of time? We move constantly. And why do we move? We move because we want to get comfortable. And if we're doing that, this means that we are chronically uncomfortable. Even in our sleep, we move. And of course, if you practice meditation, you come across this very soon when you realize how difficult a project it is in meditation practice to remain still over a period of time. Very few people find it easy. Most people find it difficult because in that stillness, the ordinary pain of the body, which is built into it, emerges. And then there's psychological pain. Our body craves movement. Our mind craves a flow of concept and stimulus. So in today's world, for example, when we're separated from our devices, mind becomes restless and uncomfortable. How often when you go into a cafe, for example, and sit down and you realize, oh, there's nothing happening right now. How often do we reach for the phone? There must be something happening. So where's the next stimulus? And when we practice meditation, we can see the mind searching for the sustenance of stories, the mind searching for some kind of conceptual stimulus. It's got to have it. And it's very difficult to persuade the mind, look, just sit still and relax. So this lack of control in the changes in our lives is painful. And it becomes clear that it's painful when we allow ourselves to notice it. And of course, we spend most of our lives deliberately not noticing it. That's one of the reasons why meditation practice is difficult, because we tend to notice it when we practice. And then we come to the deepest layer of pain. This is what the Buddha calls sankhara dukkha, the pain of constructions. And this is essentially the same as the second layer, but recognized at the deepest level as being inherent to human experience. In other words, there's nothing we can do about it. So we're endlessly moving from one activity or sense impression to another with no chance of finding a stable point where the heart might find lasting satisfaction and so rest. So in brief, this deepest level, you could see it as the absence of rest in samsara, in ordinary experience. Is that making sense? I can see a few people gravely nodding their heads. It's very encouraging. Okay, so what can we do about dukkha? Where does it fit in our practice, especially if we are practicing for insight or if we are doing insight meditation? Now, in his Four Truths, the Buddha says what we should do about dukkha is fully understand it. This is parinya, full understanding. So not trying to get rid of it, not identifying with it, but really deeply understanding it. In the later Theravada tradition, this becomes what they call dukkha jnana, the understanding of dukkha, or dukkha as insight. So here, dukkha as understood as the second universal characteristic. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. So this involves a movement from the experience of pain to that of insight into pain. And of course, you can see they're quite different. In the Satipatthana Sutta, this is the root text for mindfulness practice. This is how the Buddha introduces this subject. What he does is in this discourse is he gives a whole series of practices. So mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of posture, etc., etc., etc. All these are all aspects of mindfulness of body, then mindfulness of feelings, mind, etc. Now, at the end of each section, he has a chorus, a little section which is repeated after every verse. And it's exactly the same, except there's a slight change because each appearance of this chorus refers back to the immediately preceding verse. So, for example, the Buddha is talking about tracking body, being mindful of body. And then he gets to insight, and he describes the practitioner in this way. She lives tracking the nature of arising as body, or she lives tracking the nature of ceasing as body, or she lives tracking both the nature of arising and the nature of ceasing as body. Now you notice that the change of language, the Buddha's moving from tracking body as meditation object and noticing that it changes, that shifts into tracking change itself and noticing that these changes are happening in the body. In other words, there's been a movement from the particular to the universal. This breath is changing. All physical experience changes. And this is the movement into insight. When we're practicing for insight, it always begins with understanding the individual, the particular experience here and now. The Buddha calls this Dhamme Jnana, understanding of phenomena, or understanding into phenomena, into events. Then it matures into understanding of the universal. The Buddha calls this Anvaya Jnana, which is essentially understanding into inference. And this involves recognizing the universal patterns of experience as they play out over time. In other words, insight is always generalized. So the movement from dukkha to insight into dukkha is a movement from the particular to the universal. Now, I hope this is making sense. I'll just go on a bit more before I stop. But basically, if you think about ordinary, everyday dukkha, has anybody here ever had pain? So, a painful experience. So this is ordinary, everyday dukkha. This is not yet the characteristic of dukkha because its universality is not perceived, only its particularity. This situation is dukkha. This situation hurts, but not that one. So an escape from dukkha is possible within the realm of the impermanent. In other words, within the realm of the normal. So yes, I'm suffering pain, but I feel there could be an alternative that would work. And I have reason to pursue that alternative. It makes sense to do this. So that situation is not dukkha jnana. It's not insight into dukkha. It's not understanding of dukkha. Now, when we have that relationship to dukkha, there's all sorts of things that can happen. For example, I think among meditators, one thing that happens is that we find ourselves living alternative lives. Has anybody ever done that? Especially on meditation retreats, have you ever done that? So you find yourself reimagining the past. If only I had done this instead of that, my life would have been more satisfactory. Everything would have been okay. And we imagine an alternative future. When I get out of here, things will be different. Have you ever had that feeling in a meditation retreat? Or we even imagine an alternative present. Right now, I'll take a break, and then things will be better. And these fantasies seem real. They have power over us because our understanding of dukkha is still particular rather than universal. Does that make sense?
So, Patrick, you said that the person moves from this hurts. So, what would they move to? This.
we're going to get to there. We're
Oh,
on
right,
the
okay.
way. We're
Okay.
very close. I just wanted to check thus far. It's making sense.
Okay.
But we are getting there. Because this is basically the entry into insight, the entry into insight into dukkha, which is really crucial. Shall we go there? Shall we get moving into that? So how do we know that we're developing insight into dukkha? One indication of it, and this can sound very gloomy, is the realization that there is nothing we can do to solve our problem. Nothing. And why is this? Number one, the very need to resolve this problem is an aspect of dukkha. And number two, any solution we find will have to, at some point, be replaced by something else. This is impermanence. And then it will have to be replaced by something else. And then that will have to be replaced by something else, and so on indefinitely. So we stay trapped in the rat race, in the hamster's wheel, because anything we do to get out of dukkha is just another aspect of the experience of being stuck in it. It's like we're just running around and around and around and around and around. And it's the running around and around and around and around, which is dukkha. So, in other words, it's catch-22. This is the cheerful news of the Buddha. And when we recognize it's catch-22, that's where insight into dukkha really begins. Shall we stop there? And because it's also cheerful, we can chew on that for a few days. So let's look at this business of insight, or the word we're looking at is jnana, because this is the word in particular that the Theravada tradition uses, which we're going to look at tonight. So basically, when our understanding of impermanence changes, matures, what we find is we are directly awareing change itself. And that's when the understanding of dukkha emerges. So again, the movement from the particular to the universal. It's not that this changes, and then this changes, and then this changes. Rather, I realize actually what I'm seeing is the fact of change itself. So it's like a foreground, background shift. So when I'm in the early stages, let's say I'm meditating, and I've got a meditation object, and I'm following it. And in the background, I'm noticing, oh yeah, this meditation object changes. So I've got foreground, the particular, background, it changes. At some point, there's a shift, and I realize actually my meditation object is the fact of change itself. And oh yes, it's happening in this. Now this is very subtle. It's so subtle that it can actually happen and people don't even notice it. It can take some time before a practitioner realizes, oh yeah, that's what's different these days, because it is very subtle. And this is the entry into insight regarding impermanence. Now, insight regarding dukkha, how does that emerge? In the Theravada tradition, this is centuries after the Buddha, the Theravada mapped the movement all the way through from our understanding of dukkha to our understanding of anicca, of change, impermanence, through to our understanding of dukkha, pain, unsatisfactoriness, through to our understanding of anatta, not self. So this movement through the three characteristics. Now these are always listed in this order, probably because they're listed from listed in order of subtlety. So anicca, change, is the easiest characteristic to notice. And in terms of practice, it's possible to structure one's attention to bring impermanence to our notice. In other words, it's possible to practice impermanence. So in the Mahasi lineage that I teach in, the way this is done is by drawing the student's attention to the fact of distraction. I'm following my meditation object. Suddenly I'm caught up in thinking, then I come back to the meditation object. So the awareness is here, then it's there, then it's back here. In other words, change, 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 change. Awareness moves and we start tracking the movements. So there's a sense in which it's possible to do impermanence. You can structure a meditation technique to get you to see it. Those of you who have practiced Goenka method, when he's doing insight, what does he do? Track all the different sensations throughout the body. Change, 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 going through the body. All insight meditation techniques have this characteristic. So there's a sense in which we can get started with impermanence, with change. It's obvious to begin with, and we can actually, in a sense, do it. Dukkha, pain, is more subtle and it's harder to see. Or at least dukkha jnana, the insight into dukkha, is harder to see. Some teachers, traditional teachers, are delighted when their students report pain because they say, oh, very good, now you can experience dukkha. But that's very superficial. And the thing is, we cannot do dukkha. We cannot try to make it happen. Or rather, if we do try to make it happen, the result's much more likely to be aversion than insight. So it doesn't work. Then we get anatta, not self. That's the most subtle characteristic and the most difficult to see. And in part, this is because it's so counterintuitive. Like when people hear about not self, the first response is often, what are you talking about? I'm here. You're saying I don't exist. So it's counterintuitive. And also, not self is fundamentally an absence. It's not a something. It's an absence. Something is missing rather than present. And it's always harder to see an absence than to see something that is present. Let's say you go to a party, you look around to see who of your friends are there. That's easy. But to recognize who of your friends are not there, that's a bit harder. So we, in the case of not self, we assume that a self is present, that it's lurking in the background. And it can take a while to notice that actually it isn't. So this makes not self difficult to get, to see. And of course, we certainly cannot do not self. We cannot do anatta, because if there's someone doing it, then we have a self in charge of a project rather than not self. So we have these three characteristics always listed in this order. And one way of looking at it is listed from gross to subtle. Now, what brings this order into this system is samadhi. So samadhi is usually translated as concentration. It could be translated as unification. The heart and the mind are unified. Integration would be another one. Ajahn Sujato these days, apparently he translates it as immersion, which is very good. I like that. Now, as samadhi develops, we go deeper into experience, and our view of what's happening is necessarily influenced by that. So the deeper we go into experience, the more likely we are to pick up these characteristics. So that's a kind of linear way of looking at the three characteristics. First anicca, then dukkha, then anatta. But it's very important to remember that the three characteristics are always a single package. In other words, where there's anicca, there is dukkha and anatta. Where there's anatta, there's anicca and dukkha. And where there's dukkha, there's anicca and anatta. So all three are already present. And for practical purposes, this means that a meditation student's experience may not follow a tidy progression through these characteristics in order. So some students stumble into experiences that they have absolutely no business being in at all. And this can create problems for teachers. But let's look at dukkha jnana as mapped by the later Theravada, just to get a sense of how the tradition speaks about it. But any questions about what we just went through? Okay. Is it because you're completely gobsmacked, or because you're following everything? Let's hope it's the latter. We'll move on. So, as I said, we start with impermanence. We see change. We start to see what's going on with change. Things are changing. Now, if we say things are changing, they're impermanent, we're saying that they begin, they endure for some time, and then they end. So there's a beginning, somewhere in the middle, and an end. And our view of impermanence changes depending on the perspective of this process that we have when we are awareing change. Now, when our perception of impermanence matures, what the mind sees predominantly is the ending of things, the cessation of things, the time when things fall away. Now, this can result in some pretty weird experiences for meditators. So sometimes, for example, in a strong experience of this, meditators might say it's like they're on the edge of a bottomless canyon, or even they're falling into a bottomless abyss. They have a sense that there really is no ground to experience at all. So that if they ask themselves the question, what lies beneath? The answer is nothing, or not even nothing. And this experience opens up into an existential anxiety, or in a strong sense, even dread. If there's nothing at all, then who am I? And what is this all about? Now, when this understanding is relatively weak, this can take the form of the meditator apparently losing the concentration that he had before and being unable to focus on anything. So the meditator might be, say, in a retreat. Typically, this would happen in a retreat. The meditation is developing, the samadhi is getting stronger and stronger, the meditator is able to stay on the meditation object for longer, and then suddenly he can't do it anymore. His attention, his awareness keeps sliding off whatever he tries to attend to. So he aims his awareness at a meditation object, and it's like the awareness just slides off. Can't get hold of anything. It's like trying to grasp something that slips out of your hand the moment you touch it. It's gone. In a stronger aspect, it can be like falling into a black hole. So wherever you look, there's nothing, just blackness. Practitioners may also report the disappearance of the form of the body. So before, the meditator might have seen physical experiences break up into very specific and discrete aspects. But he always knew that they were experiences of something. So, for example, let's say breathing is the meditation object. So there are each movement of the breathing process becomes very discrete. This movement, that movement. But there's always the background sense that these movements belong together as different aspects of the same thing, like me breathing. But at this point, movement is just movement. Pressure is just pressure. Tension is just tension. There's no sense of what part of the body these sensations belong to. So the sense of the whole body disappears, and all that's left is a series of apparently disconnected individual sensations. There's no body as such. So this indicates the maturing of the perception of impermanence and the entry into the perception of dukkha. Any questions? Does that make sense? Has anybody had experiences like this? Okay, let's move on. Now, when this momentum builds, the result can be the emergence of fear. And fear is very important in insight practice. In my experience as a teacher, a lot of people report experiencing fear, and it's a good sign. It's a sign of progress. In its strong form, this can manifest as panic. In its weak form, it can be just a sense of existential unease, a sense of nothing going right, a sense of helplessness, and a sense of, in other words, a sense of a loss of control. The realization, I am not in control of my life. So this is an aspect of seeing dukkha. But one of the things about it, and this is where things really get weird, is that this fear is not personal. When we actually start to pay attention to it, when it first arises, the practitioner might not look into it, might not see it as a meditation object, might simply identify with it. Oh my God, this is terrible. I've got to get out of here. But when the practitioner remains mindful, she realizes that although there's a danger here, therefore fear, there's no one who is in danger. It's rather like watching a scary movie. So fear arises, but even as the fear is present, there's also the understanding that the situation is not real, and so fundamentally the fear is not grounded. In other words, there's no need to fear the fear. And again, this is an aspect of groundlessness, which is central to the understanding of dukkha. We realize that our fear of groundlessness is groundless. And this indicates that underneath this sense of dukkha, underneath this sense of dis-ease, dissatisfaction, there's a developing sense of anatta. Even though dukkha is occupying the foreground of the experience, in the background, when we look, we realize, there's not self there. Then, if the practice continues to mature, the practitioner realizes the impossibility of her situation, which we talked about a bit earlier. There's no refuge anywhere from this abyss. There is nowhere to escape to. Any fantasy of escape is seen to be just that, a fantasy that I would like to believe in, but I can't. This sometimes comes up if people are doing meditation retreats. It sometimes comes up as the desire to leave is very strong. But if they think, okay, if I get out of here, because this is, I can't stand this anymore, where would I go? Well, I could go back home. Would home be any better? No. And that's quite clear. any fantasy of escape is seen as it's just a fantasy. This is part of the universality of dukkha, of seeing its universality. There's nothing to hold on to, nowhere to escape to. Now, if the practitioner persists, and of course, by this time you probably realize sometimes it's a rough ride, but if the practitioner persists, there comes a turning point, and this is disenchantment, what the Buddha calls nibbida. Now, throughout this whole process, the perception of anatta, of not self, is growing underneath. And as this grows, it means that the practitioner's identification with the dukkha she is going through is weakening. So the anatta, the sense of not self, is going up. The sense of identification with the pain is going down, which means that she's not stuck in it. Now, disenchantment is a phase where the practitioner genuinely lets go of her search for satisfaction within her normally experienced world. It's like it's obvious that even if she abandons the practice and attains her most heartfelt desire, this too is unsatisfactory. There's no situation that she can imagine which is satisfactory. All her desires and fantasies are like ashes in her mouth. So nothing works, nothing will work. What is the point of struggling? Instead, she simply surrenders. She gives up. And this is the crucial turning point. And it's at this point that we get what the later tradition calls the desire for deliverance. So the practitioner is fed up with the endless rat race of samsara and yearns for deliverance from it. In other words, she learns for nibbana, the cessation of dukkha. And this yearning becomes very strong. And it can be characterized by, again, strange symptoms can pop up at this point. For example, some people will go through a great deal of physical pain and restlessness. So the meditator may be unable to hold any posture of the body for any period of time. Any posture is painful. Sometimes meditators retreat to bed to sleep for as long as they can, just to escape the unpleasantness involved in being conscious. So this is where it's like the crescendo of the understanding of dukkha. And you notice how in this aspect of insight, affect is central. This is different from, or to some degree different from impermanence. Impermanence is more cognitive. Oh yeah, everything's changing. But change itself isn't really all that challenging. This goes into the heart. This is the realm of affect, of feeling. This is why it's so challenging. What is it that moves us? What moves the heart? We are moved by sukha or dukkha, to use the Buddha's language. We are moved by the pleasant or the unpleasant. And in the case of this understanding, we are moved by dukkha, the unpleasant. This realm of affect is expressed in our desires and our aversions, like what we desire and what we are desperate to escape from. And all of this comes up in the understanding of dukkha. And from the Buddha's perspective, the fundamental question is whether we desire what he calls the sankata, the constructed, that which brings us pain, or whether we desire the asankata, the unconstructed, that which brings us the cessation of pain. Now, our deeply rooted habit is to desire the constructed, that which brings us pain. This is the world we are familiar with. This is the world we take as being normal. This is what meditators in retreats, when they're feeling shirty and upset, will call the real world. But yeah, this is all very nice and spiritual and Buddhisty, but what about the real world? What about that? Well, this is the world of the constructed. This is the world that creates our pain, which we're deeply familiar with. Now, in contrast, we don't know anything about the unconstructed, what brings the cessation of pain. So if we don't know anything about it, how can we desire it? But when we become disenchanted by the constructed, because we've learned to understand it thoroughly, then we learn to desire something else. Now, at first, this something else may be characterized entirely negatively. So what I want is not all this. It's not what I've always experienced. I don't want this. And I don't want what I can imagine that I will experience into the future. But then what is it that I do want? What is that? And this can be a real dilemma for practitioners at this point. Now, if I'm working in a practice tradition, it's easier. First of all, I might have a theoretical sense of what this might be. So I've heard people bang on about enlightenment and nirvana and so on and so forth. So I can feel encouraged in my disillusionment because I do understand, at least intellectually, that there is something, however mysterious, that's better than this. So I have a sense of direction, even if this sense of direction is defined negatively. I don't want to keep doing this. I want something else. Also, if we're in a practice tradition, if we have teachers and senior practitioners that we can look up to, so what the Buddha calls good friends, kalyana mitta, then we might have a lived sense of what lies beyond the familiar, the real world. In my case, one of my main teachers, John Hale, who was also a close friend, for me, that's what he did. If I wanted to know, what is this practice all about? I just look at him. That's what it is. And I'd calm down. But if I'm living in an entirely secular world, then I might be tempted to despair. So nothing works, nothing ever did work, and nothing ever will work. There's no meaning or purpose that satisfies. So what can I do? So you can see that this insight, this is the rough one. It can be a very rough ride. And not necessarily. Some people seem to glide through this one. Oh yeah, there's a bit of dukkha. That's okay. But other people really get stuck there, get bogged down in it, and go through it very strongly. It varies greatly from person to person. What gets us through is a growing understanding of anatta, of not self, and this is cognitive. This is what we're seeing. And this is matched in the heart, in the realm of affect, by a growing equanimity. So all the way through this exploration of dukkha, equanimity develops. If we maintain the mindfulness, equanimity develops. And equanimity is essentially balance. So the heart is strong and balanced. And when equanimity matures, we enter into what the Theravada calls Sankarupaka Jnana, the understanding of equanimity regarding all constructions, like all of them. Now, at this point, what the practitioner sees is not self. So dukkha has dropped away, it's out of the foreground. What is clear is not self, and what dominates the heart is mindfulness and equanimity. And at this stage, there's absolutely no problem. for the simple reason that there's no clinging to a problem, and therefore no one who has a problem. Now, I'm going to ask a bold question. Does anybody have the slightest idea what I'm talking about? Any questions or comments?
Thank you, Patrick. I just have a question about choice.
Mm-hmm.
Because when insight comes, there is a moment where I think choice comes in too. Yeah.
What do you mean? What sort of choice?
When you, I guess, when you view impermanence or the self, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or even pain, I think you sort of mentioned that there's a cognitive element or an acceptance element. In that there is a choice.
Yeah.
To think or to accept.
Yeah.
So what's about the thinking of the choice is what I'm just grappling in my mind with. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
there's choice. What you raise is very important because there's choice all the way through. You could, in the most summary form, there's the choice: will I continue with this or stop? And this is, will I continue with being mindful of whatever is arising? So that choice, we're always in the situation where we're called upon to make that choice. In a sense, what do I do about this? Like I'm in this situation. What do I do about it? And of course, this is the fundamental for the Buddha, the fundamental choice that we have all the time. This is what, when he talks about karma, this is what he's talking about, the choice that we have. This is the situation I'm in. What do I do about it? And we're constantly making choices. And of course, this process, in that sense, is no different. But sometimes the choices are much more sharp, as it were, because of the situation that we're in. Sharon, you've got a question?
Sorry, yes, thank you. My question relates to non-self. I've attended other, I guess, Buddhist discourse in the Tibetan tradition where I've heard non-self being described as where the self does not have inherent existence from its own side, and that's a very common description in the Mahayana tradition. But that's not how, I've heard those, descriptions, I guess, from your tradition tonight. And I was curious, I guess, to get a better understanding, I guess, from your perspective, what you mean by non-self.
The absence of inherent existence, that definition comes out of centuries of philosophy. So we have the Buddha's teaching, and then he dies, and then you get people talking about it, analysing it, arranging it, trying to work it out. What does he mean? Applying it to new historical circumstances. And this process goes on and on and on and on, and it's going on today. So in the Mahayana, you have this development of a genuine philosophical tradition where philosophers argue and debate and come up with these different ways of intellectualizing anatta, not self. So you do get very different expressions of it. And this is only to be expected. And really, it's from the practitioner's point of view, the question is, well, what makes sense to you? What can as someone, as we're in the pews, in the bench, what can I make sense of? What's meaningful to me? So if I'm hearing something from a well-established Mahayana tradition, I can pretty much trust it. Like these people know what they're talking about. But they're coming at it from a particular angle, very philosophical, very intellectual. The Buddha himself was not a philosopher. He didn't do philosophy. Essentially because for him, the arguments weren't so important. He engaged in philosophy in the sense that he debated with people. But he was much more interested in directing people's attention to their actual experience. So what he would talk about is, look, this particular experience, do you own it? Is it you? Because if you own it and it just moved, what happened to your possession? If it's you and it just changed into something else, what happened to you? So he was more interested in not self as a kind of project. Can you find something which could be reasonably be labeled self? And in a sense, he's saying, my bet is that you won't, but feel free to try. So he's much more interested in the actual practice and talking about what happens. Now, we've been talking about the later Theravada. This, again, you have a philosophical tradition that heads off in a certain direction. But here they're talking about basically analysing the experience of what practitioners go through when they practice and the sorts of things that they understand as they go through it. So the basic understanding of not self is the same throughout the different traditions, but there's different ways of talking about it, essentially. So the question is, like, what makes sense for you?
So I guess then in the context of tonight's teachings where you are, talking about that linear connection between anicca, dukkha, and non-self. How does that non-self, I guess I'm just not quite clear on how the non-self then fits into that linear, what's the non-self in that linear line?
We haven't, of course, we haven't talked about we have talked about not self. The focus hasn't been on not self. It's kind of out there on the far horizon. We're going to get to it eventually. Essentially, for the Buddha, when the Buddha talks about, the Buddha talks about not self, and I would translate anatta as not self rather than non-self. Because the way the Buddha talks about it, I think basically what he's saying is, look at this experience. Is it self or is it not self? Now, for him, self is a project. It's a construction project. We are constructing ourselves. So right now, I'm sitting in front of this little screen and I'm answering difficult and learned questions. And I'm supposed to be the teacher. I'm constructing a self as I'm the teacher and I've got the answers. And so I'm going blah, 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 hoping that I'll convince you that that's true. So this is constructing self. So the Buddha is saying, look, we think the self is already given. As the words that you use, that it has inherent existence on its own side. So you think that there's a self there. But look at what you're doing. You're creating it all the time. If you have to create it all the time, how can it be there? And what would happen if you stopped creating it? Would you feel better? Why don't you try and see? So what we're talking about in dukkha is very largely the resistance to letting go into not self. And it's interesting that the Buddha does link dukkha very closely with anatta. In other words, and this comes up in when he talks about not self in his next discourse, which eventually we're going to get to. When he introduces not self, he actually introduces it as bad news. It's painful. And the entry into not self often is quite painful. Because to enter into not self, I have to give up self. In other words, I have to let go of everything that's familiar to me and everything that I'm hanging on to. And that's really painful. So dukkha, in a sense, represents the resistance to go into not self. And some people have very little resistance. It's like, oh no, this is great. and in they go. Other people have a huge amount of resistance, and they'll fight it every inch of the way. And you get a whole series of responses. So we're coming at it from a slightly different angle. Does that help in any way, or is it?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Patrick.
Okay. Helen, you've got your Zoomic hand up.
Yeah. Hi. I'm not sure if I've got this clearly because I haven't heard a lot of this before, but am I understanding right that we have, when we have insight into specific change, which leads us to a more of awareness of the concept of universal change, and then the fear that can arise from that, and the uncomfortableness that arises from that, and then that tension builds until we reach a state where we can just release it and I think it's not submit, surrender. I think you use surrender to that, and by doing that, then we it can then release ourselves from the attachment to self, and that's more what the Buddhists talk about as being enlightenment. Is that the kind of progress?
I think that's a pretty good executive summary. I think you're doing quite well there. It's quite esoteric and quite difficult to get to wrap your head around. So you don't need to kind of understand the whole thing tonight, but just get a sense of this is where the territory is. But yeah, I think that's a good executive summary.
Yeah.
Shall we move on? We just got a little bit more. And this is, I want to enter into the world of controversy. If one is practicing for insight, what the tradition calls vipassana bhavana, particularly insight regarding dukkha, which we've been talking about tonight. So we've been looking at it in terms of dukkha, pain, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, and dukkha jnana. So insight into dukkha, understanding of dukkha. And very broadly, very, very roughly, we could see this in terms of the distinction between psychology and Dharma. So speaking again very roughly, we could say, and I'd say this as a non-psychologist, I know nothing about psychology, this will perhaps be evident as I open my mouth here, we could say that psychology deals with people and their problems. But Dharma does not. And that's a major difference between these two discourses. Dharma is all about anatta, not self, sunyata, emptiness. It's not about people and it's not about their problems. Now, one implication of this is that Dharma practice cannot solve anyone's problems. What the practice can do is show us that we and our problems are empty. And that's all. And the rest is up to the Dharma. In other words, anyone who comes to a meditation retreat in order to solve their problems is coming to the wrong place. And the Buddha makes this clear in his first truth. He makes it clear that the practitioner's job is not to solve their dukkha, but to understand it. When we understand our dukkha in the way the Buddha is talking about, we realize there is no we involved. The Buddha says to Venerable Kaccanagotta, who was a mature practitioner, he describes a mature practitioner to Venerable Kaccanagotta. He says, the mature practitioner, quote, has no perplexity or doubt that what arises is only dukkha arising. What ceases is only dukkha ceasing. In other words, just the dukkha coming and going. It's not me. I'm not part of this picture. Once we give up on the me and my problem, my suffering, my dukkha, my problem is not solved, it is dissolved. And the dissolution of the problem, this is not Dharma marketing. The Buddha means this. And in practice, it actually works. So these are two quite different discourses, psychology and Dharma. Now, the fact that they're not the same does not mean that they inhabit separate but parallel universes. They intersect, they interconnect. So we can, from our Dharma practice, learn something about our psychological makeup. And this, in turn, can help us with both our therapy and our practice. So we learn from our story. We get from our personal story both a meaning, a new variation of the story, and we learn how to regulate our attention. So, for example, from our personal story, we might learn where it would be most useful to aim our awareness, or what we should be using as the meditation object, or what conditional relationships are most worth exploring, to shed light on how we feed what the Buddha calls the roots of the unwholesome. But at a fundamental level, we learn we are never going to find the right story. When I talk about this, I like to sum it up with a brief verse that I came across at Wat Suan Mok in southern Thailand many years ago, painted on a wall in Thai, and then underneath it, English translation. And the English translation says, and it's got a picture of a fat Chinese monk doing a Qigong stretch with a big grin on his face. And the verse says, "O boundless joy, now I see there is no happiness in this world." And this paradox sums up Dukkha. Okay, just to end on a controversial note, any final questions or comments?
Thank you so much for that, Patrick. It was